for that great testimony. I'll recognize myself for questions. Actually, you've anticipated my first question, which was, what impact would President Obama's pledge in Paris have on the Earth's climate? I think your word was it would have a trivial impact. You said all the pledges made in Paris would affect temperature by only 1/3 of a degree over the next 85 years, and the cost would be about $1 trillion a day. Is that all accurate as a summary?
Yes.
Okay. Here's a more recent question that just came up this morning because President Obama said a few hours ago that he blamed climate change for flooding in Miami, Florida. The President said, you go down to Miami, and when it's flooding at high tide on a sunny day, the fish are swimming through the middle of the streets. There's a cost to that. However, the President's statement that Miami flooding is linked to climate change, in my view, is entirely false and, in fact, disputed by meteorologists at the National Weather Service. Those meteorologists have reported that the lunar cycle and wind patterns are to blame for unusually high floods in Miami, not climate change. Do you feel that the President's statement linking the Miami floods to climate change is just another example of alarmist rhetoric, or do you think it's accurate?
Unfortunately, I'm going to tell you a little more complicated story. I don't know the specific issue of Miami, but in general, it stands to reason that as temperatures rise, as sea levels rise, we will have more problems, for instance, with flooding. But what is incredibly important is to recognize that most of these things we know very well how to deal with at very low cost through adaptation. The simple answer is the Dutch have shown the way for a couple of hundred years. So
Okay.
Again, trying to deal with this through climate policies is probably one of the least effective ways to help people who are actually flooded. So remember, global warming is a problem. Global warming will cause problems. But the way that almost every catastrophe you see is being used as a way to bludgeon us to say we should cut carbon emissions as the only solution is unfortunately very often the worst or the least effective way to help.
I understand, and I understand also and appreciate your talking about the need to put more funds into research and technology, and I totally agree with that. By the way, if it comes down to a choice of taking the meteorologist's word for it or the President's word for it when it comes to Miami flooding, every time I'll go with the meteorologist. Let me go to Mr. Grossman for my next question, and it is this. How much impact on climate change, a little bit repetitive, will the Clean Power Plan have?
Well, by the administration's own estimates, the impact is incredibly minor. And keep in mind, that even assumes that the Clean Power Plan remains in law. In my view, the most likely outcome is that it has zero impact on climate because it is ultimately struck down by the courts as both unconstitutional and inconsistent with EPA's statutory.
And if it is unconstitutional, what impact does that have on the President's pledge?
It would actually have an enormous impact. Something like half of the, actually more than half of the estimated reductions that are fully enumerated in the INDC that the White House has released are attributable to the Clean Power Plan. So if that's off the table, we're not, under the way they've enumerated, we're still 30% short. In that instance, I think we would be something like 80% to 90% short. It's a very big gap.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Grossman. Mr. Cass, is any agreement President Obama makes legally binding on the United States?
Well, I think as Mr. Grossman testified, there are things that the President could agree to in Paris under his sole executive authority with respect to things like transparency and reporting measures. But he's not able to commit either to binding emissions reductions or to the appropriation of funds. Any of that would need to move through Congress.
Okay, thanks. And who would be hardest hit in the United States if the President's emissions reduction package was implemented? Yes.
I think the primary costs are in the energy sector and then on those who rely on the energy sector. So the expectation is certainly that electricity prices would rise, and that affects both consumers as well as industries that rely heavily on the use of energy. And
so the American family will pay a price.
That's exactly right, and that's what they've seen happen in Europe when they tried to pursue similar policies.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Cass. The gentlewoman from